Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kadri Liik. I'm Senior Policy Fellow of ECFR, and we have gathered here today to discuss the role of outside powers in Ukraine. And for that, I am joined by two wonderful colleagues, Asli Aydintasbas in Turkey and Hugh Lovatt. Hugh is in London, I trust. And also with us today is China expert from Carnegie, but also he has written a paper for ECFR, Alex Gabuyev. And we will focus on the roles that Turkey, Israel, and China are playing or might be playing in Ukraine and Ukraine's war against Russia. Now, I think we will start with Turkey and Israel. These countries both have been in touch with both Kiev and Moscow, and might harbor some ambitions to mediate in the conflict. However, although so far on practical level, that has not mounted to much. So Asli, why don't we start with you? Could you maybe describe Turkey's overall vision or positioning vis-a-vis the conflict? Because Turkey has been supplying arms to Ukraine, at the same time manages to stay in speaking position terms also with Moscow, which is rare, I would say. And so what's behind it? That what is the thinking and Turkey's ambition in this situation? We don't hear you.
Sorry. Thanks, Kadri, and good to be here with colleagues. Well, you're right. Turkey is, this has brought limelight, once again, the spotlight on Turkey after several years of very real regional isolation. I'm old enough, I think, to remember when there was a discussion in 1990s about Turkey's role and is it still relevant? And then, lo and behold, the Iraq war happened and Turkey became a critical ally once again. And we are almost going through a very similar moment in which several years of questions about Turkey's relevance, particularly from the Biden administration over the last years, have now ended because there is a war exactly in Turkey's background. Turkey is a Black Sea state and is a NATO country. Yes, it's selling armed drones to Ukraine and continues to support Ukraine, but has established very close relations with Russia, so on and so forth. So all of a sudden comes out of isolation. There's no doubt that this has provided a huge opening to Erdogan himself, I think, in some ways, because he's had more visits over the past week, foreign dignitaries, than he's had over the past several years. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly, because Turkey is not joining the sanctions on Russia. Even though it's a NATO member, and is engaged in what seems to be a process, a balancing act of sorts. But there also seems to be this interesting understanding of Turkey's hedging, a sort of understanding from Western partners and NATO partners of Turkey's hedging because of the huge vulnerabilities that it has towards Russia in particular. And the relationship between Ankara and Moscow has been this very strange competitive cooperation. Yes, they do cooperate. They have cooperated on Syria and on Caucasus, and certainly on energy and critical infrastructures in Turkey. But there's also very fierce competition, and at times something that cannot be described as anything but a proxy war. And we've seen this in Libya with the two sides supporting opposite sides in the conflict. And we've seen this in Syria. So there are also economic vulnerabilities. Turkey's become very reliant on Russian natural gas, but also on Russian tourists. So it is out of the sanctions regime, but the real vulnerability comes from Syria, and I won't go into it, but I'll just say, Ukraine is important for Turkey and has been an important strategic partner. Turkey is selling armed drones, but also has been getting critical technology transfer from Ukraine. But Syria is an existential matter. So that is why I think Erdogan has been treading on this space so gingerly, using a very cautious language when it comes to Putin and Russia. I mean, using very naive sentences, if I could say so. We can neither give up on Ukraine nor on Russia, refraining from heavy criticism in the public space. But this doesn't mean Turkish decision makers are not alarmed by what's happening, because the truth is Russia does have the upper hand in Syria, does control Turkey's southern flank, has only increased its leverage in the east, in the Caucasus, particularly southern Caucasus, and now is possibly going to control Turkey's northern flank. And so, there's this duality in the Turkish position. Publicly, very cautious. Oh, we have to hedge, and balancing act. We cannot have sanctions. But privately, quite a bit of concern about the future, and also stepping up engagement with NATO. From the government perspective, I think it does seem to me that the economy is the critical matter. This war has found Turkey at a time of 50% inflation, at a time when, only a few months ago, people were talking about a bank run or a balance of payments crisis as a possibility. So there will be an obvious need, and not just that, the bulk of Turkish wheat exports come from Ukraine and Russia. Natural gas, again, similarly comes from Russia. So I think that trying to keep the economy afloat will be an important priority, particularly given that we are entering an election cycle soon in Turkey. Even though the government here has clearly had illiberal, if not authoritarian tendencies, it is a country where you really have to win elections. It's very different from China or Russia in that sense, because Erdogan has to go out and, visiting city by city every single day for months in order to, and also trade favors and work out on things in order to win elections. And I think that there is a desire now to use this crisis, this war, to elevate Turkey's position, and Erdogan is an international personality once again. This is obviously going to be important for his chances of being re-elected, because also he's facing an anti-Erdogan majority at this point. And so both the economy and his stature, international stature, will be important in reversing that trend for the government, and will be used in that regard. Mediation, you have mentioned maybe a few words on that before I stop. So I think both Turkey and Israel, and Hugh will talk about Israel, but do use mediation, and also it provides some sort of a cover for this hedging that's going on. But I think that in conversations with Putin, the understanding from the Turkish side seems to be that Russia is not ready for a deal, that it's going to be very hard for the leadership there to agree to something before, at least before having realized at least some of their military goals, but that their position is also different than what it was 5 weeks ago. So that there's some improvement on both sides, but not really, but we're still at least a couple of weeks away from a ceasefire point. And finally, I think Turkish negotiations are not maybe the most important part of the mediation efforts that are going on, but Turkish people in Ankara seem very cognizant of the fact that they may end up playing a bigger role down the road, both when it comes to mediation, particularly between Zelensky and Putin, but also in terms of if and when there is a ceasefire, in terms of providing security guarantees for Ukraine. Let me perhaps end here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Asli. I think you're right that any peace deal is still some way off, but it is interesting to see outside powers trying to bring it closer. So let's move to Hugh. Hugh is our specialist on Israel and Palestine, and the Prime Minister of Israel has also been active and also in touch with both sides. There is also, of course, a special connection with President Zelensky, who is himself Jewish and from Eastern Ukraine. But as it seems to me, that fact doesn't translate into the support to Ukraine, but rather Israel's role and thinking seems to be more complicated. So, Hugh, why don't you tell us?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kadri, and colleagues at ECFR for putting this together. So maybe picking up on what Asli was talking a bit about, the mediation and why Israel is doing this. And I think there are similar dynamics and considerations to Ankar's view and calculations. Admittedly, I think Israel has far less balls up in the air than Ankara. But nonetheless, there are, I think, real interests, or Israel sees real interests at stake. And I think that that has pushed it towards this sort of balancing act that Asli talked about. And so I see mediation as a function of Israel's balancing act and Israel's attempt to kind of hedge between Moscow and Kyiv, of course, but also between Washington and Moscow. And so obviously, if Israel can be a mediator, and it is being a mediator, and it can actually pass messages on, that's, I think, really good and to be encouraged. But we should also be very clear in terms of why this is happening. In many ways, I actually think mediation, it allows Israel to justify being neutral and not taking a position. And so why is Israel trying to remain neutral and balanced? So I think one of the core interests is, of course, Syria. And Israelis or Israeli officials regularly refer to Russia as their neighbor to the north, ever since Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war. And for Israel, one of its key national security considerations or priorities is to keep Iran and Iranian proxies away, which are operating in Syria, away from Israel's northern border, and also to interdict the flow of Iranian weaponry through Syria to Lebanon to Hezbollah. And so this has led to a number of Israeli airstrikes against Iranian targets and Iranian proxies in Syria. But because Russia is effectively in control of Syria and Syrian airspace, Israel requires a degree of coordination with Russia to allow its airstrikes to go forward. And so I think this desire to maintain a working relationship and coordination with Russia is one of the key issues here. Now, what's interesting is in the early days of the war, the Israeli government was under pressure, including from its public, but I would say also from the Israeli policy community. And I think there was criticism that actually Israel had sort of shifted too close to, or was according too great a priority to relations with Russia, and neglecting its important strategic relations with Washington, and that there needed to be a bit more of a balance. That yes, Syria, as for reasons I explained, is important, but ultimately, the strategic relationship with Washington is the overarching and overriding priority. And I think then we started to see Israeli offers to mediate, and so that's, I think, one of the core dynamics. And it was also a way for the Israeli government to respond to public pressure to take a more principled stand. And so you did see a lot of Israelis saying that actually, this is a state, issue of morality and principles in international law, and that Israel needs to stand up for this international order. Of course, not referencing its occupation of the Palestinians. But nevertheless, there was this sort of call for a more principled stance. And then just finally, I would say, actually, this sort of mediation and hedging strategy, it also works quite well within the context of Israeli politics and the Israeli governing coalition. So you have Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, who's much more, I think, realpolitik. And then you have the foreign minister, Yair Lapid, who is at least styled himself as much more principled. And he's one of the only, or maybe the only Israeli minister to have criticized Russia's actions. So actually this principled and realpolitik, I think it works quite well when you're trying to hedge in this regard. And then just finally, maybe to pick up on a few other points, this balancing act has been difficult. As I said, trying to get it right, trying to hedge or try to get the balance correct between Washington and Moscow is always difficult. But it's also led to, I think, a very rocky relationship with Kyiv. And so you've seen criticism from Ukrainian officials, including from President Zelensky when he addressed the Knesset on Sunday, basically saying that Israel is not doing enough. That how can you mediate between good and evil, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next day there was sort of a mea culpa from the Ukrainians saying, no, we appreciate this. So anyway, so I evoke that just to say that this balancing act is difficult for Israel. And again, against the backdrop of having a Jewish president in Ukraine and Israel styling itself as the protector of the Jewish people, there is an interesting dynamic. And then finally, another dynamic that we could explore later is obviously Israel's own connections to Russia. So I mentioned the security relationship, which is important, and Israel has gained, I think, a lot of insight and experience of dealing with Russian officials and senior level officials through that. But obviously, there's also, the personal connections between many Israelis and Russia. So there is a large Russian Jewish segment to Israel's population. One of the ministers who's been accompanying Naftali Bennett, Zeev Elkin, who's met Putin a number of times, was actually born in Kharkov. So there are also these very deep personal relationships. And I think also, because you have a large Russian population in Israel, that's also another factor in terms of how you balance it, right? So there's a lot of dynamics which I think are quite interesting. But the final point would be, I think at the moment, Israel is still very much a messenger. And I don't see it. I don't think we can say there's an Israeli political initiative at the moment, for the reason that Asli mentioned, that I don't think the parties themselves are yet in that space where you can really push forward much of a political track at this moment.
But Hugh, what is the public mood in Israel? I mean, we have been talking with Asli that in Turkey, actually, sort of Russian talking points find quite some traction in the media and in people's minds. But how is it in Israel?
So with the massive caveat that I am talking to you from London, but I think there is clearly a lot of public sympathy for Ukrainians and what Ukrainians are going through. And as I said, I think that was one of the reasons that sort of pushed the government to try to at least be seen to be doing more. And I think what's interesting, though, is there is some sensitivity, though. So when Zelensky criticized sort of Israel for not doing more, and also using comparisons to the Holocaust, which is always a very sensitive subject, basically saying Ukraine saved Jews Ukrainian Jews during the Second World War, and now it's time for Israel to save Ukrainians. And that actually provoked a lot of criticism from Israelis, saying, how dare you use comparisons to the Holocaust, despite the fact that Israeli politicians regularly deploy these such comparisons for their own political reasons, especially when it comes to criticizing EU policy. But so there is that kind of sensitivity, I think, and nevertheless, I think that is pushing the government to try to do more. But there's still a very clear red line, which is that the Israeli government will not provide advanced weaponry or any weaponry to Israel, which is the core demand that the Ukrainians have at the moment. And so instead they're deploying field hospitals and everything, which is something that the Israeli public supports.
Thank you, Hugh. And let's now turn to Alex. Thank you for waiting. We left China the last because China is sort of slightly different story. In some ways, China really is pivotal power in that conflict, in the sense that if China indicated that Russia doesn't have its support, then probably Moscow would be forced to rethink what it has gone itself into and how to get out of it. For as long as it can expect China's at least tacit understanding and some support in view of China's own standoff with Washington, I think calculation in Moscow might be that, okay, we have wrecked our relationship with the West. That's bad, but it was also inevitable, and there is China on whom we can rely on a few critical issues. So is that calculation correct? Is that so? And how does China position itself? How do you understand it? Alex.
Hi, Kadri. Thanks, and it's great to be with you. I don't think that its support or relationship with China that has enabled Mr. Putin to launch his war in Ukraine. I think that based on my experience discussing this with the Russian officials, of course, nobody knew that there was a war, but conflict with the West was seen as something that Russia can sustain because of all of the preparation work. And the Russians have been very proud of the de-dollarization effort, the foreign currency reserves that the central bank managed to amass, the progress of the import substitution program. Of course, as we now know, they have very lofty and outsized expectations and ambitions with regard to those programs. And those programs don't necessarily pass the test of really crippling and unified transatlantic sanctions. We need to remember that China is still about 18% of Russia's external trade, and flow of money coming from China is important, but it's dwarfed by the flow of money coming from sale of hydrocarbons to the European markets. China is an important hedge in terms of the currency reserves. Russia holds about 12 to 15%, and we have kind of a delayed picture published by the Russian central bank in RMB denominated instruments, and that's 10 times the global central banks hold on their balance sheet. Like a normal central bank will hold about 1.5%, but that's only a part of the story. So I don't think that it's China's support of the relationship with China that enabled Mr. Putin to go through this war. China was taken by surprise. The Chinese analysts didn't envisage this war. That was a scenario that some people in the Chinese foreign policy machinery and intelligence community have looked at and established that it's just so reckless, so counterproductive for Russia's own national interests that Vladimir Putin definitely doesn't pursue those scenarios. And what he's looking into is pressure tactics and leverage in his discussions with the Europeans and NATO and the US about European security arrangements and military relationship between NATO and Ukraine. And I think that bulk of the people in the analytical community also thought that the downsides of war are just so obvious, even if it's swift and victorious for Russia, that Vladimir Putin is not about to do this. So China was taken aback. I don't think that the war has been discussed during the much publicized summit meeting between Putin and Xi in Beijing on February 4. As far as I know, the discussion, that the direct discussion was not there at any time. And if there was a conversation about the Olympics, it was a very elusive way to talk around the issues and making sure that nothing happens during the Olympics. So China came unprepared, and China had to adapt to the realities. where it comes to the war itself, China doesn't need balance its interests against values or principles. It's balanced one set of Chinese interests against another set of Chinese interests. And one set of interests is that relationship with Russia is of paramount importance, not only to Xi Jinping, but to China in general. It's a giant nuclear armed neighbor. Stability on the northern border has price for China because it doesn't need to spend resources on protecting this border. Territorial dispute is long solved. And as long as Russia can remain a friendly neighbor in the north, China has the ability to focus on other priority areas, be it security buildup in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait or the Senkaku Islands, the China-India border. And Russia is also a source of military technology that is very important for the modernization of the PLA and its ability to stand up to the task to push back against the US in East Asia. It's an important source of raw materials, most notably oil and increasingly so natural gas. And it's also like-minded power on the Security Council. So keeping this relationship with Russia friendly and stable is a value in itself. And at the same time, China has this big reliance on Western markets, Western technologies, and Western money. And although this relationship is worsening for reasons that are not connected to Russia-Ukraine war, it's because there is a big shift in the transatlantic, how the transatlantic community and American allies in Asia view China. And even if China is helpful to the US in terms of this war and it withdraws some cooperation with Russia, it's not that American views or European views or China will alter. It's not that the issue of Xinjiang or suppression of freedom of expression in Hong Kong will go away. China knows that, but at the same time, it doesn't want to accelerate this rupture with the West because of Ukraine. So what China does, it has developed a set of talking points that are very similar to the way that China reacted to 2014 annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass. China says that it supports peace, it denounces war, it supports territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and at the same time, it doesn't criticize Russia, it doesn't support unilateral sanctions and actually criticizes the sanctions. And there is a mild tilt towards criticism of US-led military alliances, be it NATO in Europe or AUKUS in the Pacific. When it comes, and then depending on who is in front of them, China calibrates those messages. When it's the Chinese ambassador in the US, Qin Gang, who wrote recently an op-ed in the Washington Post, he goes like, oh, China didn't know about this war. And by the way, we support territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and we are helping Ukrainians in need who are now wartime refugees. When the Chinese are talking to their Russian counterparts, they underscore that, oh, it's our denouncing of US unilateral sanctions that are not helpful at all. And then, yes, it's the expansion of NATO that brought us into this conflict. And then the more the West is trying to push China on taking a stance and like being a responsible part of the international liberal order, China just doubles down on repeating those very talking points that serves China's interest perfectly. And in material terms, I think that for now, China continues with all of the contracts that are signed with Russia. Some of Chinese companies are exercising extreme caution because of the mounting sanctions. And China doesn't want to violate any of those sanctions. We have seen that since 2014, that China is religious about observing the sanctions regime. Here, Chinese risk compliance ability about Russia is very weak. There is not that much banking business that China does in Russia. So sometimes it's engaged in over-compliance, but not because it's changing its position or is hostile to Russia, but because there are risks of secondary sanctions. And at the same time, China is not stepping in to do something material to help Vladimir Putin's war machine or to help the Russian economy. Because this economy is in free fall, sanctions are snowballing because unfortunately the ugliest pictures of this war are likely in front of us, not behind us. So more sanctions are coming Russia's way, which means that if China is to sign deals, it needs some sort of stability and predictability to understand what's possible and what's not, and then be engaged in any type of garage sale if Russia wants to have more Chinese material support. So now it's a standby mode. It needs a stabilization and the end of open hostilities, and then China will figure out its next moves. Final point on mediation. We don't have any examples of Chinese successful mediation in any international conflict, particularly of that magnitude. China hates when there are foreigners coming to China and saying, oh, Mr. Xi Jinping, this in your national interest to let the people of Xinjiang express our desire for more autonomy, or there is this national interest to kind of have freedom of press in Hong Kong. They hated guts. They know that Russians hated guts when foreigners tell them what to do. So why would Xi Jinping put himself in a position to tell Mr. Putin what his national interests in Ukraine are? China tries to be kind of on the sidelines when the US pushes them to play a more active role in the negotiations. There is a Xi Jinping call with Vladimir Putin, and then why he can claim that, oh, we are enabling the international community's diplomatic effort. And then Putin is talking to Scholz and Macron partially because Xi Jinping is also talking to him and asking him to be engaged in this diplomatic process. But that it's all sideshow. It's not something really tangible and material. So the international community should count on Chinese mediation effort. Over.
Yes, that's true. It has always sort of sounded fanciful to me too. And as you say, I don't really remember China ever trying to seriously mediate in any significant foreign conflict. The audience, you can start sending questions. You could try to raise your hands or use the Q&A function, and we will try to spot the questions, ask them, or give you opportunity to ask them yourself. But meanwhile, Alex, a follow-up question to you. I mean, you say that China's talking points are similar to those of 2014. At the same time, I mean, some China experts also say that there are still significant differences, that, you know, if in 2014, China was, I mean, China's effort to distance itself from Russia was much more visible back then. And now, you know, there is still sort of degree, or there is a difference in how they position themselves, even if sort of de facto they try to stick to the same points. The emotional background is different. Would you confirm, or?
I think that what's different is the coverage of this war in the Chinese media. And then about 2 weeks ago, if you would turn the Chinese TV or read through the Chinese mainstream media or follow the discussion on Weibo or WeChat, you would think that you are in Russia and basically you are watching the first channel because a lot of coverage was very sympathetic towards Russia. And I think I would agree with my George State University colleague Maria Repnikova, who did a terrific piece in the Atlantic studying this. And her main takeaway is that it's not really about Russia and Ukraine. It's about somebody standing up to an American proxy. So it's really a reflection of a change in the Chinese public opinion, which becomes increasingly nationalist and increasingly anti-American. And same with the statements of people like Hua Chunying or Zhao Lijian, so the spokespersons of the Chinese MFA, the so-called wolf warriors. What has changed since 2014 is that the US-China relationship is in a very different place from where it was under Barack Obama. And that's reflected. So this conflict is also viewed through the lens of the global pushback of US-aligned powers, particularly Russia, against the US. And it's also viewed through the lens of US-China competition. China doesn't want to make things worse, for sure. It knows that the steeper the relationship with the US goes off the cliff, the more time China has for kind of self-strengthening and working on import substitution and becoming less vulnerable to potential US economic pressure. But it knows that all the trend lines are pointing to this direction. It's not that if China is helpful to the US in this crisis, that the US will kind of remove Huawei, for example, from their sanctions list, or that the Europeans will say, oh, actually, Chinese are good guys, and they can continue to purchase strategic assets in the European Union. So there is this sea change in Western attitude toward China, and no amount of support to the West in this crisis will change that. China knows that perfectly, and that's why it will not throw Russia under the bus.
Thank you, Alex. Of course, the outcome that seems to be emerging is sad in the sense that everyone, I mean, all three powers we are discussing here today, their actions are motivated by considerations that are quite remote from the actual suffering in Ukraine. We are getting some questions, and I will probably take them in the order I see them. Our colleague Maida is asking Alexander, do you anticipate that China might send covert military assistance to Russia? And that is something that has been talked about. It was recently in the media that Russia has asked China to help. In the West, that was interpreted as a sign that Russia is in deep trouble. Then, as you among others explained, that that's probably not the case. There is different background to that story. But anyway, would something like that be expected in the future or not?
I don't think so. I don't think that China will provide military assistance. And I think that the story that was in the media has a certain background and needs a proper framing. First and foremost, turning to China for material assistance in terms of drones or any other equipment doesn't make a lot of military sense. It would take, like, even if they are taken from the PLA stocks, it takes weeks and probably months to deliver them to Russia. If we are talking drones, it takes months to train the Russian operators. If we are talking munition, it takes time to adapt them to the Russian platforms, because even reverse engineered Chinese missiles need readaptation to the Russian fighting platforms like jets and other systems. So it doesn't make a lot of military sense. And then Russia has the munitions, it has drones. So it doesn't need an immediate Chinese help on this. And then I think that what actually happened is that we know that Russia has expressed interest before to some of the Chinese systems, particularly attack drones that are superior to those of Russia indigenously produced. And Russia was in talks with China about purchasing some of this equipment. So what most likely has happened is that part of this communication happened after Russia launched its aggression against Ukraine on February 24. That was intercepted by the US intelligence community and was leaked to the media. But then the framing was that it's not part of an ongoing negotiation that predates the war, but that's part of Russia's request for military assistance. And then it is framed as part of the request for immediate assistance for this particular war, which is not accurate. And then all of the media reports and that the conversations between the US government officials who passed this information to the media happened right before Yang Zhi's meeting with Jake Sullivan in Rome and before Biden's call with Xi Jinping. So to me, it looks like more a way to frame correct intelligence. So it's not, it is information, it's a correct piece of intelligence, but that needs proper framing. And that was an attempt to put more moral pressure on China. But again, China just doubled down on the talking points and didn't even say that, oh no, we will not send war assistance or any military assistance to any of the fighting parties. It was just very much sticking to its own talking points.
There's another question from Philip Mead about arms supplies, this time from Turkey. The Turkish drones that have really been very effective, as we have seen. The question is it likely that Russia will come to see Turkey as a hostile power and take action accordingly? And And indeed, I mean, there were statements from Moscow that any convoy of weapons headed to Ukraine is seen as legitimate target by Moscow. So, Asli, is that something that Turkey is concerned with? And later, maybe I will also ask Alex to add from Moscow's perspective. I mean, what are they prepared to do to stop military supplies from Turkey or from the West going to Ukraine? But Asli, you first.
Yeah, yes, I think this is of concern. As you mentioned, Bayraktar drones have been quite effective and also popular in Ukraine. Ukrainians have sort of made songs about it, and I saw footage in Kherson the other day protesting the new civilian or new Russian military administration and singing a Bayraktar song by Ukrainian public. So. And also, I'm not a military analyst, but people I have spoken to do mention that they've been surprisingly effective in terms of hitting supply lines, and even particularly in the evenings, and in terms of some of the Russian losses. Now, I think there was a tendency to dismiss in the beginning how effective they would be, particularly on the Russian side, because the conventional wisdom that we'd heard from military analysts was that in the type of conventional warfare that Russia intends to conduct in Ukraine, these drones won't make much of a difference. But that wasn't the case at all. A Russian army had more difficulty advancing its goals, and the Turkish drones were more effective than people imagined. So Turkey is in this interesting situation. I think they're being very quiet about drones. Turkish media, which typically boasts of Turkey's drone capabilities and has done so in Syria, in the war in Azerbaijan, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, certainly in Libya, and the drones were Turkish trolls, were busy publicizing the effectiveness of Turkish drones in these past conflicts on social media. Now there is not a peep about their use, not in government media, not in pro-government media, and not in the Turkish social media space. So obviously, this is intended to, not to antagonize Russia, and but there is a real danger, which is what the question is all about. 2 years ago, indeed, when there was a point of tension between Turkey and Russia, 33 Turkish servicemen were targeted in a Russian air attack in Idlib, and I think that underlines what the danger is. I think Russia and Turkey have found ways of messaging one another their displeasure, and often in the Syrian space, where Turkey still has a number of observation posts. They are clearly vulnerable in the sense that Russia controls the airspace, and there's also, and also. Russia is at the Security Council. Several million people living inside this safe zone, 30-kilometer, and I think Russia, they do know that Russia could make it difficult for them politically to stay in Syria. So there are vulnerabilities for sure, also in terms of refugee flows into Turkey coming from Idlib. I'll be very interested in hearing what Sasha has to say, but I think that it's not clear what the understanding between Turkey and Russia is when it comes to drones and other bits, because these two countries have made it almost an art form to be friends yet fight one another. And obviously this is not sustainable forever, but they have been able to do it in Syria and Libya. And drones are very much part of that that situation. Now, have they now, made it, is the Russian calculus going to change now, whereas perhaps they've dismissed the drones early on in this war and are taking it more seriously now? I do not know. But what I can see on the Turkish side is sort of a desire to continue supplying them, and not just to Ukraine, but to neighboring countries as well that are willing to buy it, but keeping it very, very quiet. Kadri, you did mention, you did refer to a previous conversation we had on the sort of anti-Western sentiments in Turkish media. It almost seems to be a cover that is useful for the government to continue to supply drones to Ukraine. I mean, I think Alexander has also talked about these talking points in China that are clearly anti-Western, but you can only cover something so far. So I do think it's going to be a very interesting conundrum for the Turkish government. But on the other hand, let me just say that drones are also the key to maintaining a good relationship with NATO partners. And the one thing that Turkey has put on the table to say, I cannot go ahead with sanctions, I cannot use a very sort of harsh language against Russia because I have this vulnerability. Therefore, they are also a card that Turkey has grabbed when it comes to improving relations with United States and Europe, buying a sort of immunity from criticism of all sorts when it comes to that. So I think Turkey will continue supplying drones, but yes, are there risks in terms of its relationship with Russia? Yeah, certainly there are.
Thanks. Alex, I mean, using you as Russia expert and not China expert, so how, what in your view Russia might do about arms supplies to Ukraine, the ones from Turkey or the ones that come from the West via Poland or other countries on the border?
I think that supply of drones is seen as unwelcome, but inevitable. There is nothing that Russia can really do about Turkey supplying weapons to its ally, Azerbaijan, and then beating Russian ally, Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh. And same with Ukraine. I think that Russia was underestimating the effectiveness of Bayraktar and overestimating its own conventional ability to shoot them down with Pantsir-S and all other aerial defense assets available to the Russian armed forces. We see that the operational security was not as efficient as the Russians have hoped, but they will adapt militarily, most likely. They know that trying to choke off this supply of Bayraktars to Ukraine isn't possible because you don't have any leverage to put pressure on Turkey. Turkey is the NATO country that is not imposing sanctions, and it's one of the lifelines that Russia still has, and one of the connections that it still has to the outside world. It's a mediation partner. So you don't want to disrupt this relationship where you see clear Turkey's commercial interests. And as Asli has just rightfully said, that's one of the excuses where Turkey can put Bayraktars on the table and say, hey, NATO, we are helping Ukraine a lot by providing this technology. And that's crucial. And just that's why we are not introducing sanctions to Russia. When it comes to attacks on convoys, we all saw Lavrov's statement on this. And I think that the Russians mean it. So what NATO is probably willing to do is that no NATO country's personnel is driving those convoys inside Ukrainian territory. And that if the Russians are ready to strike convoys with NATO drivers, Russia has publicly said that this is a red line. Whether NATO is willing to test this is questionable. So to me, probably NATO will put this convoy somewhere in Poland and then use Ukrainian military personnel to drive them into the country through secure routes and just trying to avoid Russian direct fire and find ways to deliver them to Ukrainian hands. but not use NATO personnel for that. I would actually expect Turkey also to use land routes through Poland rather than maritime delivery route through Black Sea because of the Russian naval blockade of Ukrainian coast. So I think that there will be ways to deliver Bayraktars to Ukraine, but they will be increasingly challenged by Russia, and that will be kind of attacking the convoys, but not going after Turkey or Turkish economic interests or other interests elsewhere.
Well, to finish with the drones, there is another one from someone anonymous. When you send the question, could you actually maybe add your name as well? That would be helpful. But the question is, Asli, I think to you, will the Bayraktars becoming a symbol of Ukraine's resistance provide a softening in the embargoes imposed by NATO countries on the Turkish defense industry? Embargoes on Turkish defense, yeah, it's not my forte, but you know.
Well, Turkey is under CAATSA sanctions for its purchase of everything coming together now in this conflict. Turkey is under CAATSA sanctions from the US government for its purchase of S-400 missile systems from Russia, which it cannot use. In part because now the strategic calculus is changing and it is trying to improve the security relationship with NATO and the US, though the missiles are sitting somewhere in Turkey, not really fully operational. I do think the answer is yes, that it will ultimately lead to a change in the sanctions regime, and there will be an effort to draw Turkey closer to NATO. I think there might also be a desire on Turkey. There will also be a desire on Turkey's part. We're not there yet, diplomatically speaking. I think these sanctions are easy to put, but very difficult to remove. And the conversation between Washington and Ankara has just started. I think for the first year of the Biden administration, it's been very much a policy of social distancing to Ankara, but more towards President Erdogan. So now that they are, because of the war in Ukraine, are starting to talk, I think ultimately it might lead to a more leaner US position, particularly when it comes to things like Turkey's desire to purchase F-16s, upgraded F-16s. Turkey's already kicked out of the F-35 program because of S-400s, but they might be able to purchase down the road F-16s, which is something Ankara said it wants to do. So, but just to say, this conversation is just starting, and it wouldn't have started if it weren't for the Ukraine war and the drones, that's for sure, I think.
Well, I have a question to Hugh. I'm afraid it's a naive one, and I don't know how to phrase it properly, but I'm somehow trying to understand Israel's position vis-a-vis Russian rhetoric justifying the war, because you know, and Israel should know it quite well, given the number of Russian speakers they have in the population, and how they keep an eye on things. I mean, much of Russia's rhetoric that justifies the war is really nowadays highly reminiscent of Nazi rhetoric, or I mean, the rally in Moscow in Luzhniki, someone in Russian Twitter compared it to Berlin 1936. It is chilling, and it is deeply dehumanizing when it comes to Ukrainians, and not only Ukrainians. So is that picked up in Israel at all? And how is it interpreted? Is it sort of, is that something that would make people restless, or is it rather that never ever compare anything to Holocaust, and you know, and that would probably make people to pay less attention to it? Or, you know, details like that the death of that old man whose name escapes me right now, but he was 94 years old. He had passed through 4 concentration camps on the territory of Poland, and now he died in Kharkiv due to Russian bombing. I mean, that sort of thing should strike a note in Israel, but does it actually?
It's a good question. So specifically in terms of the dynamics in Russia that you mentioned, I haven't seen that being picked up at all. But I think it does go to a bigger question. And I think this war in Ukraine, I think once again, it sort of reaffirms Israel's own perception of itself, or the perception of Israelis of their country, which is as a protector of the Jewish people and as a safe haven for the Jewish people. And so alongside all the things I mentioned in my initial introduction, a key aspect of Israel's response has been to work to evacuate Ukrainian Jews and bring them to Israel. And this is something that Israel has done in the past when Jewish communities have been in danger. And so it famously did that, evacuating Ethiopian Jews, I think during the 1980s. So I think, this is another moment for Israel to kind of do what it was kind of created to do. Its raison d'être. And so that has been, I think, a guiding principle. And I think that's the thing that's played out in the media, right? In terms of Jews under threat, but it tends to be framed within Ukraine, Jews under threat in Ukraine from Russian attacks. And there was a Russian attack against forgive me, I forget the name of Baba Yar, with the site of the massacre of Jews in Kyiv, and that obviously also deeply resonated with Jews around the world, and especially in Israel. But to go to your question, I think there has been less focus on kind of, if I can say, anti-Semitic acts in Russia, or comparisons to Nazism.
Yeah. Yes, and I didn't mention the attack on the memorial or cemetery. That was also, and another thing, I mean, also striking, Russians speak of Ukrainians as neo-Nazis and anti-Semites, among other things, but it's just not the case. I remember we were in Ukraine soon after the uprising in 2014, and we met with leaders of Jewish organizations, and all Westerners would ask about that, because that's a sensitivity in the West as well, and a big no-no. And the leaders of Ukrainian Jewish organizations said that anti-Semitic incidents we have had about like 3.5, and it's really not a thing. Anyway, I guess that's another question. Shota Keneria wants to come in and ask his question live.
So I was interested if any of the panelists could develop on, let's say, realistic, desirable end state in this war at this point. So we are discussing the ongoing events and what can happen and what will be the consequences. But when it comes to the end state, so where is this possible point of divergence where the Ukraine could possibly accept, and also Russia could accept, any conditions where we will say, okay, now the war is over and we're moving to the negotiations phase? And I'm asking this question especially in light of what we're seeing now with this indiscriminative bombing of the cities and possible war crimes that are being documented by many organizations and countries. So is it possible to negotiate ceasefire with Putin and his regime at this point? And how would West actually see this end state of this war? Where is that possible solution there? Thank you.
Thank you. I think That question probably should go to Alex with your Russia hat on. Can we negotiate with Vladimir Putin?
Yes, you can, but unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about the current state of negotiations. As I said, that the ugliest picture of this war are likely in front of us, not behind us. So if people are shocked what they saw in Mariupol, they should brace up for more similar or even worse content to be in your phones in the coming weeks. We see that the demands of the two sides and the red lines are unreconcilable. And as the diplomats say, before everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. So you can agree on neutrality of Ukraine, you can agree on non-NATO inspirations, you can agree on modalities of the Ukrainian army going forward and of foreign bases and limitations of foreign military supplies. You can, in theory, agree of denazification, whatever that means for the Russians. It's just unclear. But you can probably find formulas around there. But the demands by the Kremlin to recognize Crimea as part of Russian territory and Donbass, like Donetsk and Luhansk republics in their administrative border, is definitely a no-go zone for President Zelensky, because you see that the society is very much opposed to that. And Ukraine is to some extent hostage to its own spectacular military success in the opening stage of this war and to its victory in the propaganda warfare. Like the global information war is totally dominant by Ukraine, and no surprise. And that leaves the society with an impression that victory is just around the corner and we just need to hold on for a month or so and we will chase the aggressors out. Despite the very courageous and very skillful fight of Ukrainians, I don't think that time is on Ukraine's side in the short to medium term. Long term, of course, Russia cannot sustain its occupation. The population is not pro-Russian. So ultimately, Russia will need to leave Ukraine. We leave Crimea outside of this for the time being. But then in the short to medium term, I think that the basic factors about this war, that Ukraine is massively outgunned, are there. The operational combat readiness of the Russian forces might reach its culmination for the time being, but we shouldn't neglect Ukrainian losses in material, in particular people, and everything else. So the Ukraine's capabilities to push back have also significantly diminished. As Vladimir Zelensky is not going to tell his people that surrendering Crimea for the time being is the price that we're going to pay to save more lives and infrastructure and buildings in Ukraine proper. That's just not going to happen. And it's not that Vladimir Putin will go home after everything what he has unleashed. Without that, I don't think that he will seek a negotiated settlement somewhere else, but on the battlefield. And the final very unfortunate development here is that one of the Russian demands is removal of sanctions or partial removal of sanctions. That cannot be agreed between President Zelensky and President Putin, even if they meet. That can only be agreed between President Putin and President Biden. And for now, we see that President Biden is not very much willing to be personally engaged in this diplomacy. He tried a lot before the war, and there was the diplomatic path out of this mess, or not to enter this mess, offered by the US. And we all read in the El País what kind of counter proposals the Americans have developed that really addressed a lot of Russian security concerns. They've been neglected by the Russians because they had, as it turns out, a very different design. President Biden has spent a lot of time and a lot of political capital talking to President Putin. Why would he do so now when he's fiercely attacked by Republicans? So it's probably the belief that you can agree on something with President Putin and that he will honor those deals is small and not worth the risk. And as long as we don't have this very senior level US-Russia discussions, no amount of President Macron and Chancellor Scholz talking to Putin will substitute this, unfortunately. So again, my conclusion is that Russia will seek victory on the battlefield, and because like conventional and gentle and surgical, if you can use those terms, tactics obviously doesn't work, it will resort to pure brutality, and we all going to be terrified by what we're going to see.
Thank you, Alex. That's highly depressing. We have also, on a related note, we have a question also about the role of the US, suggesting that the key to peace talks is in the hands of the United States. So should we think that it would be helpful if the US step forward to talk directly with Russia rather than hide behind, provide arms and provoke Russia? I mean, Alex already replied half of that question, but Asli, you have spent considerable time in the US not so long ago. You might also have perspective on that.
Kadri, this is very interesting. I do share Sasha's pessimism, because a war of attrition, a grinding war of attrition, is of course something that is not in Ukraine, not something that's going to help Ukraine. And as I think Sasha has said, it is a victim to its own success, particularly in terms of being able to, Zelensky being able to mobilize his own population. From, I think, a US perspective, it's very clear that the Biden administration cannot be talking about or negotiating any deal that's not acceptable to Zelensky himself. Ukraine has become a very much a domestic issue. And in that domestic issue, in midterms approaching, appeasement, in quotes, or trying to pressure Zelensky, anything that looks like weakness on the US part is not something that's going to be acceptable to the administration. Even though it may make more sense on a strategic level for this war to end as quick as possible, I think there'll be domestic constraints in Washington. And it's very clear that therein is the power of Zelensky. He's already been the game changer in this whole equation moving forward. And I think that down the road, it's going to be what Zelensky is willing to agree to that defines what the end game is, whether it's Crimea, Donbass, whether it's significant concessions on Crimea or Donbass or not. I think that's going to be something that US will just have to, for now, accept. Perhaps, though, at the end of it, no ceasefire will be good enough unless you're right, I think, and Sasha is right. And no ceasefire will be attained unless US is willing to step in and seal the deal, because any kind of ceasefire negotiations will have to have some understanding about sanctions relief, and that's not something that Zelensky can deliver. It's something Biden can deliver. But unfortunately, the understanding is that right now, we're not close to a ceasefire of any sort.
Yes, and I think on that question, actually, there could be differences among Western allies as well. I mean, looking at people's statements, I can see that actually Biden at least tries to indicate that there is a way out of that for Russia, but some sanctions can be lifted if you stop it. At least in the first week of the war, he tried to get that message across, and I think it is still the case. But of course, there are other countries, surely in Eastern Europe, but not only, for whom the issue has become very binary, that there can be no sustainable relationship with Russia headed by Vladimir Putin. So the end of it needs to be Russia being punished in proper manner after those crimes. And that, of course, creates some policy dilemmas. Now, we have a few more questions. There is a question about Russian leverage with China from Philip Mead. do we not underestimate Russian leverage with China? Russia supplies China with oil and gas, cooperates in pipeline building, is opening up the Northern Sea route, providing access to Arctic. So could actually Russia put some more pressure on China than we assume? Alex, that's for you, I see.
I don't think that Russia has much leverage, and this relationship has been asymmetric before the crisis in favor of China, and then the balance was tilting in favor of Beijing, even without this terrible war that disadvantages Russia a lot. And Kadri has written an excellent piece on this end of last year. I've written about this also end of last year, and I think that we coincided on this. Here, I think that this war gives China even more leverage. Oil and gas can be replaced. Yes, China is reliant on this, but then it can purchase it in open markets. Yes, direct oil pipeline and gas pipeline from a friendly nuclear arms neighbor is preferred, but that's something that China can live without. The one thing that China really needs from Russia is peace along the border, and that's also in Russia's interest, and then military technology. And I think that now it's just all more in China's hands, where once the situation stabilizes, and let's assume that the hostilities in Ukraine are the level of hostilities that we are witnessing in Syria or somewhere in the Middle East, and that's a protracted conflict with a more or less established line of contacts, and then there is a Russian occupation that continues and takes death toll on the Russian side, but it's not something that like the kind of brutality and dynamism that we are seeing for now. The sanctions are in place, so China might step in, but then all the cards will be in China's hands, and China will be able to dictate the terms. I don't think that Russia really has that much leverage in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is another China question that I will read in a second, but just to give you all a heads up, we are 15 minutes from finishing, and there is the question to all panel: what is the realistic end state for the West in this war? So I will put that to all of you so you can start thinking. Also, another question about the role of Global South. Food security issues will affect them. Brazil is dependent on Ukrainian grain, Russian fertilizer, oil prices rocketing everyone. I'm not sure, we don't have really experts on Global South among us, but let me sort of transform the question into if you have anything else to add on the sort of longer term perspectives or longer term consequences this war will have on the regions you are following. So Hugh and Asli, I will come back with that to you in a second. Meanwhile, the last question to Alex, and that concerns China and Taiwan. Does the war and the sanctions from Western states to Russia affect the calculation of China might have about Taiwan? Does China shy away from falling into the situation that Russia has fallen into in the international arena? Probably having in mind launching a war and drawing the fire of sanctions. Do you think China, I mean, is drawing any parallels to Taiwan, or is that a totally separate issue in their mind?
I think that's a separate issues, even from a legal standpoint. Officially, Taiwan is recognized as part of China by majority of the international community, including the US, and there is a Taiwan Relations Act, but it's unclear what kind of security guarantees the US is ready to provide to Taiwan. I think that if China has a design for military option that's more of a military option as a leverage to force Taiwan into negotiation, but this military option needs to be very credible, and it takes years to prepare from the current standpoint. So now Taiwan is a poisonous pill. In order to prevent US interference, you need to have a credible nuclear deterrent on par with the US, and we see reports that China is busy building that deterrent. You need to have much more capable conventional army and navy and missiles, and that takes China another decade. So if there is a big gun to be put on the table to force Taiwan negotiate or free unification, it's not now, and it's not kind of probably this decade. Many things can happen, but that's the baseline assumption. I think that the lessons that China takes is that, Russia was lulled by its own songs of very successful import substitution and de-dollarization and relative immunity to sanctions. And now the sanctions have called Russia's bluff. So China is engaged in similar programs on much larger scale and being much more meticulous and well organized, but the weaknesses are there. And there is a weaknesses of supply chain where, for example, you have a large industrial tool worth $100 million, and it's 90% import substituted, but there are a couple of particles that come from these particles since 19th century. And without those very particles, which are worth like 50 euros, this very expensive industrial tool is just the iron garbage. So you need to be able to kind of see what's there in the supply chain and be able to import substitute this or have enough stash of these particles. And that takes really a lot of time. I don't think that China's lesson will be, let's go back to the 1990s when we were this cuddly, lovely developing country, not that aggressive, and everybody liked us. I think that they will see that, we're doing the right thing, but we need to double down on our effort to import substitute and not be as stupid, as arrogant as the Russians. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now the final question on the end state for West, or any longer term implications for different regions that we know about and have not yet discussed. Hugh, why don't we start with you, this one?
Sure.
Any thoughts?
So obviously the end state for Ukraine is up to Ukrainians to decide. I think from a European perspective, and from my personal perspective, as someone who was actually in Maidan during the revolution in 2013, I was very struck by the pro-EU sentiment and the EU flags and all this. And so I think from my perspective, obviously preserving that and supporting that pro-EU sentiment, I think would be quite an important aspect. But then briefly on two other aspects. One is, of course, the big picture stuff is the need to defend and uphold obviously international law and the prohibition on conquest through force, and the core tenet of international law that war is illegal, except for specific cases of self-defense, which this is not, and that might is not right. And so I think the outcome, whatever happens in Ukraine, I think that norm needs to be preserved. The other point, I think, also from a European perspective, is that this is unfortunately now not just about Ukraine, and we've seen how Ukraine is, and the sanctions on Ukraine and rising energy prices, rising wheat prices, is having an impact all over the world, but especially in the Middle East. And so I think another final outcome that I would want from this is, of course, to be able to maintain and to stabilize the Middle East, Europe's southern neighborhood. A number of, especially North African states, are increasingly fragile for a number of reasons in terms of bad governance and other issues. And clearly the war in Ukraine has the potential to exacerbate this fragility, to rekindle conflict, to deepen humanitarian crisis. And obviously that has direct impact on European interests. So I think our response needs to be calibrated not just in regards to Russia and to Ukraine, but also in terms of how do we actually engage with the Middle East, try to head off the worst impact of the war in Ukraine there.
Thank you. Alex, anything to add from your side? And then I'll finish with Asli, with whom we started as well.
I think that the second order effects of inflation will be really detrimental for both developed and developing markets. Unfortunately, the divisions inside the Western societies that are the real problem with Brexit, Trump, and everything else. It's not the rise of authoritarianism. It's really the breakdown of Western model that can be pull more people into the middle class. The inflation will affect Western societies, both in Europe and America. And unfortunately, that will be the fuel for more societal rupture. And that will be visible in the midterms and the next presidential election in the US. I think that will be very visible in the any campaign and elections in the European Union. And then on the global scale, the same discrepancies between the developing world and the developed world will be kind of fueled by the inflation of wheat prices, particularly in the Middle East. And that was one of the sources of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, it's likely that we will have more to come.
Depressing as ever. Asli, your final words.
Thank you, Kadri. Well, it's the end state is difficult to entirely imagine because so much depends on what happens on the ground, but we can expect more of an acceleration of some of the trends we've already been seeing in global politics and international order. Clearly, what was surprising is the sense that this war will lead to a stronger EU and a stronger NATO. That, of course, is already an unexpected outcome of this short last 5 weeks. But also, the very existence of the war also does accelerate another trend, which is EU in terms of its relations with external powers, perhaps transitioning from more of a normative, more of a transformational agenda to more of a transactional approach. I think that countries like Moldova, countries like Poland, even though Poland is in NATO and EU, are clearly feeling very, very vulnerable. And this war will directly impact the type of security arrangements they can count on or not count on, which does bring me to the other point. And again, it's very clear that there will be some reordering of the space in the European security order, which will be the direct outcome of the set of negotiations between Russia and the West. But we're not there yet because what the new European security order will look like will also depend on where the pieces fall at the end of this war. But clearly already nuclear weapons are something that is discussed. It was brought up very by the Russian officials and PESCO yesterday in a conversation with Christiana Manpur has not ruled them out. But that opens up all types of questions that we thought had long been terminated about who can have nuclear weapons and what their use is. So it would not be too crazy at this point to think that it would start some sort of a desire in various parts of the world, but also in the periphery of Europe for nuclear weapons, clearly. And, I do think that it would also strengthen the tendency of countries like Turkey, perhaps some countries in the MENA region that Hugh has talked about, to pursue an alternative strategic autonomy, but also a third way, not Russia, not the West, but Turkey certainly may improve its relations with Europe and NATO, but will not see this as a pivot back to the West, rather some sort of a reason to pursue a strategically autonomous course, I think. So too early to tell, but it will change a lot. That is clear already. And none of the lessons are necessarily for a more peaceful existence at this point.
Well, and on that happy note, not happy, of course. On that note, we will finish. Thank you very much to our three speakers. Thank you to our audience being with us for all the questions, and thank you ECFR colleagues for helping to set it up. And yes, until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.